Well, Ralph Nader, welcome to the public.
Thank you.
Now, your latest book, Told You So, the big book of weekly columns. It's a collection of the weekly column you've been writing for over 40 years now. Now, the title of the book, you've spoken about how it's basically the genesis is how for years there's been all these names, whether it's in finance or in the environment, who spout ideas to the press and to the public. And then time and time again, they're shown to fail. These policies that they advocate fail, and yet there seems to be no clawback behind that. They still get their op-eds published. They still get to go on TV. I want to ask, are there any favorite examples you have over the years of these such of incidences? Do you have any examples that really stand out in your mind?
Oh yes, many of them. You have Dick Cheney, George Bush. You have Paul Wolfowitz in the Defense Department. Don Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, Elliot Abrams. They all told us that invading Iraq would be received with roses in Baghdad, overthrowing a dictator, who was our ally, by the way, for years, Saddam Hussein. And look what happened. We blew apart Iraq. We have caused the deaths of well over 1 million Iraqis, 5 million refugees. Every day now, 30, 40 people are being blown up. There's sectarian warfare. Al-Qaeda is in Iraq and metastasizing into Syria. And before we invaded Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and there wasn't the bloody sectarian fighting. And the sociocide of Iraq was the direct result of our invasion. And so Paul Wolfowitz gets big lecture fees. He was rewarded by becoming head of the World Bank, from which post he had to resign. Cheney, of course, making millions of dollars. And Don Rumsfeld just published another book. And they have access to public officials. Now moved to Wall Street. You have Larry Summers and Robert Rubin. They deregulated Wall Street under Clinton administration in 1999-2000, saying it would modernize Wall Street and it would be better for investors. It was a total disaster, of course. Wall Street crashed.
And they specifically tried to stop the derivatives market from being regulated.
Yes, yeah, they opposed any regulation of derivatives. They got rid of the separation between commercial and investment banking under Glass-Steagall law. And where are they now? Well, Summers became a chief advisor to Obama. He went back to Wall Street, made more money, and now he's being considered as head of Federal Reserve. And Rob Rubin, he made $100 million off Citigroup, and his policies as co-chairman brought Citigroup close to bankruptcy, and he had to fly on a weekend in a secret meeting with the Secretary of Treasury, Paulson, who was head of Goldman Sachs before he took the Treasury job. And Bernanke got a multi-billion dollar bailout for Citigroup. So you see what happens? Meanwhile, on our side, the progressive side, again and again, whether it's William Greider, Jim Hightower, Gloria Steinem, all kinds of progressive writers have warned about deregulation. They warned about Iraq. They warned about the job-depleting impacts of NAFTA and WTO, and they can hardly get on public TV. They can hardly get on public radio. They don't get massive advances for their books and speeches, and they don't get entry into the councils of government. So that's a sign of a decay in our political economy, and that's why I called my book Told You So, and that's why it amounts to a grip on reality. These articles taken together are grips on reality, on what the situation of power and justice and injustice and outrage and democracy and war, the realities, replacing the myths by which people are controlled from the hills of oligarchy and plutocrats.
You mentioned public radio. I think one of the most interesting columns I read in the book was when you point out that, like you just said, even progressives can't get on, or often underrepresented, even on things like NPR or Charlie Rose. You point out that you've never been on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, or and list some of the guests that have been on Charlie Rose, and often they're right of center, far from it being Noam Chomsky or Louis Lapham or yourself. It's rare that those type of figures get on, and often that the people whose policies have been discredited sort of get a form. What do you see as the actual process? Like, what's actually going on here?
Well, actually, is that first of all, the corporatists in Congress are much more aggressive in intimidating public radio and public broadcasting, because some of the money comes from Congress. Second, more and more, the bulk of the money is coming from corporate donations, AT&T and Verizon and oil and drug companies and so forth. They make charitable contributions
to PBS and things like that.
Yeah, to PBS and NPR, and that develops a culture of caution. So it's safe to have right-wingers on, and then they have liberals on that basically are neoliberals, and they don't make the distinction between liberals and real progressives. And their checks don't bounce for their salaries, so it becomes a comfortable sinecure. And the progressives don't really challenge NPR and public radio and public broadcasting. They're not as tough and demanding as the right wing is.
Mm-hmm. So because it's taken for granted and there's nowhere else to go, they sort of feel like they can't really object?
No, they can object. I'm objecting, but I don't see any of the others really objecting. They just take it. They are resigned to it. So, if Tom Friedman and his cheerleading of corporate globalization gets on Charlie Rose 70 times, which is the number, even more, people like William Greider, they just don't have the temperament. They don't have the toughness of condemnation that the other side has. And besides, they think, well, it's great if they get on once in a while. Well, I'm constantly hearing and listening to Grover Norquist, William Crystal. They all get on far more on C-SPAN, on public radio, on Charlie Rose. So you got to speak up. You got to demand. And the criminals are prosecuting people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden. They're being prosecuted by people in government who are violating laws. They're violating the surveillance laws, and judicially approved wiretapping is something that they've maneuvered around with a secret court, and they don't even bother with the secret court on their dragnet snooping on all exchanges, telecommunication and email. So that's what you have. You have the innocents, the people who blew the whistle, who followed the Nuremberg principles of exposing wrongdoing. They're the ones who are being prosecuted, not the violators themselves, not the warmongers, the war criminals.
Now, one of the themes throughout your work and your writing, and I think your message over the years has been, at the end of the day, people have power, and they need to sense that power if things are ever going to change. There's these massive systems, but at the end of the day, they're human constructs. And I wanted to ask you about when you developed that sense that you actually could make a difference. Like, I of course, there's the famous case of your work in car safety and taking on the big car manufacturers. But was there a point even before that in high school or university when you started to get a sense that you could have an impact just as a single individual?
Yeah, I began to realize a single individual representing broader public sentiment can have a great effect. And dozens of them can have even a greater effect when they're linked together. It's a lot easier than we think to turn around bad directions in a society that at least has a structure of democratic assertion and possibility, like Canada and the U.S.
But what
it's
about
a lot easier than we think.
And what about your life, though? Were there any small things like you hear stories that Michael Moore tells about? He ran for the I think it was the school board when he was still in high school, and through that he started to feel his sense of power. Were there any examples like that you got? I mean, you clearly were a very intelligent student. You went to Princeton and Harvard Law. Were there any examples when you started to flirt with taking on authority or things, standing up for things you didn't feel were right?
Yeah, in little personal ways. I didn't tolerate abusive teachers, for example.
In what sense?
I spoke up in class, but it started in a more comprehensive manner with a trip I took around the United States and visited a lot of Indian reservations in the 50s and was horrified by the conditions. And then I began asking, why am I losing so many of my friends in traffic crashes in unsafe cars? So those are the two that really began arousing me to take a stand and to have a higher estimate of my own significance as a involved citizen, connecting knowledge to action. And that's what people have to ask themselves. There are two types of people who have completely dropped out of any democratic process, electoral, political, town hall, provincial, you name it. They just have private lives, and they moan and groan about things they don't like in the public sphere. And then there are the few who really get engaged. And it doesn't take more than 1% on any major issue in the population really engaged, reflecting public sentiment and public opinion to make definitive changes. I mean, if you had 330,000 people in Canada organized to deal with the North American security perimeter integrative pressure by the United States, you'd have different people in Parliament, and you'd have a different prime minister. You'd have a different policy. And pick any major problem afflicting Canada, and just assume if just 1% of the people would organize reflecting the public sentiment of their neighbors, it's decisive.
It's interesting, though. I mean, like you say, it doesn't take that many people, but perhaps the reason why there's so few people willing to speak up is because, like we were just saying, with what happened with the Iraq War and people who spoke out, it does come with huge consequences if you challenge power, and you have experienced this throughout your life. I mean, when you started taking on the car manufacturers for not building safety measures into the cars, GM hired a private detective to try to dig up dirt on you. What gave you that confidence to be able to stand up to, I guess, all the attacks and all the mudslinging that can come up with being part of that?
First of all, I'm not blistered by moonbeams. Second, I knew I was right on the facts. Third, by their reaction to me, I knew I was even more right. And fourth, I knew how to expose them in the media and before Congress, and they were hauled up for congressional hearings where they had to confess what they did. And of course, that damaged their lobbying effort, and we got the motor vehicle and highway safety laws through in 1966, signed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. So that's the sequence, and it requires persistence and stamina, nothing more than what is required to be a good hockey player or a good football player. If we translated some of our energies from the sports arena to the civic arena, we'd have quite a different situation. But the Canadians, and I co-authored a book called Canada First, which was a 40-week paperback bestseller in 1993, on all the areas Canada was first in, whether it's credit unions or, Medicare for all, way ahead of the United States in so many manners. And Canadians just weren't interested in why Canada was first in so many ways. In fact, I had trouble getting it published until McClellan Stewart finally published it. So if Canadians look back and say, who are these Canadian citizens who sparked all this, who invented this, who organized the first children's hospital, who organized the first children's theater, who opened the first daily radio station, who laid the first cables transatlantic to Europe and so on, who established ombudsmen, and so on. And you get heart when you look at history, and you say, well, these people, they did a lot of these things without electricity, without motor vehicles, without paved highways, without telephones. What's our excuse? A Canadian hero is Tommy Douglas. Look at his bravery that started Canada on the way to Medicare. I mean, just look at what your forebears brought to your country that we don't have. You have full health insurance for everyone. We don't. You have full maternity leave. We don't. You have paid sick leave. We don't. You have children's allowances every month, checks. We don't. So you can see that after a while, the answer is people have got to get involved. Everything starts with conversation, and then at 2, 4, 8, 10, 16, 30 citizens, you get underway. That's the way the student movement started in the United States in the 1960s. So let's stop making excuses for ourselves and get to work. We're both countries that have more problems than we deserve and more solutions than we apply on the shelf. Although you're ahead of us, your social safety net is being frayed by the same corporatist interests that are wrecking the U.S. safety net. Mm-hmm. So the more we become aware, and I urge all Canadians to read John Ralston Saul's book, The Unconscious Civilization.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books, actually. I mean, like you just said, through history, you can, and people like Tommy Douglas or Bertrand Russell, you can see single individuals who've managed to really get involved and make huge changes, actually, or even things like the 8-hour working day. When you were becoming more politically active and aware, were there any people in history that you really looked up to as a guide or took as an example of what can be done?
Yeah, of course. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, early on, and then, of course, throughout history, fighting Senator Bob La Follette from Wisconsin. There were a whole host of people. Eugene Debs, the great labor leader, Norman Thomas, the leader of the Socialist Party, ran for president 5 times and pushed Franklin Delano Roosevelt into doing things for the American people he might not have done. Yeah, I mean, you got to learn from these people.
And so, for you, reading their stories, that sort of emboldened you to take on the
yeah, very much so. I used to read muckraker's books with an ear to the New York Yankees baseball team on the radio. I'd read the books and I'd listen to the Yankees. Those are the years when they used to win.
You just mentioned, I mean, it takes incredible perseverance and resilience. And I think one of the things that most struck me in reading the columns and learning more about just the full scale of the contributions you've made over the decades is how different things are now compared to the 60s and 70s. I mean, it was amazingly under Nixon that the institutions you started and the efforts of you and the people around you made, that you were actually able to get through a lot of the things that are still with us. So with in the American system, from the EPA or the Freedom of Information Act and all these incredible things that in many times were signed by Richard Nixon. And then Reagan comes in and there's been this slow beatback against regulation and against oversight and protection.
Well, 2 things happened. The corporate interests counterattacked. They beefed up their lobbyists, their money in politics, etc., putting their people in high government positions. And the other thing is that the couple million people that were really active started receding, and they weren't replaced by the next generation. Because Nixon was the last Republican president who was afraid of liberals and progressives. And a lot of the good bills that he signed because he was afraid of the rumble from the people back home. And as the rumble became more and more faint, the boldness of the corporatists and the right wing became more prominent. So that's really what the scene is. We've got to get a couple million people really engaged so they have as much fervor and focus, stamina and interest as serious bird watchers have to watch Wall Street and Washington.
You're renowned for constantly working, and you've said, or people have said, that you only live off of $25,000 a year, and you basically have devoted yourself to working on the issues you care about. And this is very easy, or sort of you can gain momentum and heart once you're actually making the victories, like you actually did. But then there's been this long stretch where it seems all the best efforts of many progressives have actually not how it's been losing ground. Could you talk about just, I guess, how you've been able to stay so resilient throughout so many disappointments?
Well, it's easy to be resilient when the alternative is surrender. I don't like that type of situation. Second, you're right. I mean, things have become much more difficult. We couldn't get through today what we got through in the 60s and 70s in terms of legislation. But on the other hand, there are things we stop that don't get news. There's a victory here and there, an amendment here and there. But it's not going to be done without 1% of the people really becoming very engaged. I know that Occupy Wall Street had the slogan 99%, 1%, the 1% of the super rich and 99% rest of the country, but they didn't mention the other 1%. The 1% of serious, engaged, linked together people in every congressional district, turning the country around by starting with Congress, which is the real lever, the one branch of government that has the constitutional authority to turn around the other branches and the states as well.
One point that I found really interesting in your book is, I think it's a column in 2007 where you're talking about how you've tried to recruit lawyers to start working against the sort of legal overreaches of the Bush administration. And the responses you got back from the people you contacted were quite telling, in that some of them said, I'm too busy, or the issue is too controversial. I'm retired now, or I don't want to give up my leisure time. And it seems like, in a way, I feel like what stops almost a lot of us from taking on or becoming more political or active in the public sphere is that it does take giving things up. There's a lot of comforts that come along if you are in a position of power and influence.
Well, that's a mistaking personal freedom for real freedom. I mean, young people make that mistake a lot. You say, "Are you free?" Yeah, sure, we're free. You're free to buy what you want, or have friends who you want, or marry who you want, or travel where you want, and get whatever music you want. But that's not civic freedom. That's personal freedom. And what these lawyers were doing was, as officers of the court, no less, they were preferring their own personal leisure and absence of controversy to their professional obligations to make sure the rule of law and the Constitution are observed, for starters, and to lead the way, as they can lead the way because they understand the interconnection between law and power. But we've got to get over these self-indulgences. These are self-indulgences. So they want their leisure, but what kind of leisure are their descendants going to have as the country heads for the cliff? And fewer jobs, and fewer livelihoods, et cetera, more poverty, more militarism. See, I mean, it's just a matter of what you think life's all about, and what's important and what is secondary. And furthermore, how much leisure are you going to have 100 years from now with global warming and all the rest that's coming over the horizon?
And have you ever slowed down? I mean, do you still keep the same sort of seven days a week work week?
It's a way of life. Yeah, it doesn't become a onerous burden.
You never feel burnt out, or like you need to take a break, or?
Well, we take a few days here and there,
but still 7 days a week throughout the year, more or less.
Yeah.
When did you actually decide to spend your entire life sort of as a professional citizen in a way, or a public citizen. Was that just a slow evolving once you started to make the gains in the 60s, or was that a conscious decision?
We had a lot of victories, and I began to realize it didn't take that much civic mobilization as a percent of the overall population if you stand for just directions that are supported by a lot of people, however passively. And so I started a lot of groups, and they started groups. And, that's why optimism is important, because once you go to that tipping point where you become self-denying in terms of your own impact on society, and once you, write yourself off up against, as they say, City Hall or ExxonMobil, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And automatically, the corporate interests become more powerful.
But it seems like it's a knife edge that you have to walk between being realistic about your power, because otherwise it could be defeating if you don't get through the change, and at the same time not taking for granted that you do have an impact.
That's true. You're always looking for new ways, better ways for ideas to catch on, new ways, new people, new strategies. As long as you have that attitude, you don't get into a mode of discouragement. And the other thing is we have so many solutions, our respective countries, that we're not using. I mean, we're not Bangladesh. And that, of course, gives some people optimism. We know that solar energy and wind power and energy conservation were the solutions decades ago to our energy problems. Well, they're still available. I mean, some are being deployed, but it can be faster.
And where do you think this sense of powerlessness comes from? Why do we generally seem to feel so paralyzed as citizens?
We grew up that way. We grew up corporate. Television gets to us at an early age. Advertisements describe the products, and so they're all good: hot dogs and double cheeseburgers and soft drinks. And the other side criticizing this doesn't get on. So, kids grow up corporate. They don't grow up civic to further civic values and subordinate commercial values to serve civic values like health, safety, respect for the environment, clean government, and elections. So it starts with our educational process, which is very, very skewed, very vocational at its best, very rote learning. And one reason why students are bored and turned off, they don't go to a school that connects their learning to their own community outside the school, the town hall and the river or the lake or the housing or whatever. So we grow up corporate, and if there isn't anything after we get out of school to teach us civic skills and mobilize us from the neighborhood up, then we become just passive acceptances of increasingly unjust influences and power structures. Now, once people break through that, and they do every day one way or the other, here and there, but it needs to have quantitative significance. It needs to be a broad national movement. You know what I think the biggest mass movement in America is?
What?
Animal rights.
In terms that it's widely mobilized?
Yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, there are politicians who are more afraid of animal rights coming down on them, people, than there are of children's rights. And look at all the child poverty. I mean, if we starved cats and dogs, put them in hovels, if that was done by Congress, there'd be hell to pay.
Right. Because they'll actually get the feedback, they'd get the letters, they'd get the calls.
Yeah.
It sounds like your parents were very influential in sort of instilling that civic mindset within you. How did that occur? What did they do in particular that helped form that idea?
Well, they took us to marches. They took us to town halls, a lot of town halls. They took us to a local county courthouse at a very young age, just to observe. They didn't segregate us as children when we had visitors. We sat and listened to the adults speaking. And, of course, a lot of it was on politics and conditions, local, national, international. So we absorbed that. And then my parents were active in the community. they never made a big deal out of it. It's part of living. And we watched that, and we absorbed it.
It was just
we never
like nature.
told to do this or that.
Right. It was just what you did as in the community.
Yeah.
Were you ever considering just like you worked at a Connecticut law firm after you graduated? Were you ever considering just following a regular career path as a lawyer?
No, I just wanted to get some experience. And at the time, I was pushing for auto safety. So it was like a dual role.
So even...
And, lawyers tend to get listened to by legislators when they testify.
So even by the time you were going to law school, you were doing it within the mindset of this was how you're going to help have political change. Yes,
exactly. So now our big immediate cause is getting the minimum wage up to a little past Ontario, which is $10.25. In our country, federal is $7.25. And show you the differences between the two countries. Walmart has to pay Ontario workers $10.25. They can get away with $7.25 south of the border in many states. So we have a nice website, timeforaraise.org, which has petitions, fact sheets, step-by-step advice on how to make the issue boil and steam and go all the way to the legislative arenas. And my guess is if we had 1 million people who just spend 10 hours each in the next 3 months on their senator and representative, we'd get it. Now, is that a big deal? I mean, look how many people watch the Super Bowl. It's a lot easier than we think, and that's why I wanted to have the subtitle to my book, Told You So, a lot easier than you think. Because once you have confidence as a citizen, your opposition's power shrinks.
And is that what your message would basically be to citizens who maybe want to get more involved but have hesitated for whatever reason? Is that it's
yes, that's the message. And if you want evidence, go through the best moments in Canadian history and U.S. history, and you'll see how a tiny number of people started mass movement.
I mean, just on that point, I mean, you've, working 7 days a week, you've given up so much throughout the decades to be a sort of a political active citizen. And I think some people look at that, or you and Noam Chomsky, or just the degree of commitment and dedication, and that almost in a way seems, well, I could never do that, right? So why would I even start? So
that's why history is important. Look at Duff Conacher of Democracy Watch. Single-handedly, he monitored the banks. He got a lot of media, and he was a major factor in stopping the deregulation of banks in Canada the way they were deregulated in the U.S. and crashed the economy through Wall Street. I mean, just think of what he did. He was a young lawyer. He knew how to get his views through the media. He was factually accurate. And he had a 1 or 2 person office in Ottawa, and look what he did. And so, he started out with no power. He had knowledge, he had determination, he had sense of strategy, and he stuck to it. Duff Conacher.
To just end off, though, I mean, I'd like to get your thoughts on. There's just so many big issues now confronting society as a whole. There's climate change. There's the environment generally. There's inequality. There's the NSA and surveillance. There's so many huge issues, and I find myself sort of becoming overwhelmed in that they're all very complex. And if you sort of need to commit yourself to learning about one, I feel, or to get very involved with one, because otherwise,
what is the one institution that connects all of them? It's your Parliament. It's our Congress. So if you take popular control over members of Congress, it's their job to deal with these issues. They have the resources and they have the power.
So you're saying, as a focus in terms of most people would be to work on getting the specific people into Parliament or Congress.
Yes, that's the key. Not the only key, but that is a key, especially in our country, when the Congress has by far the most powerful branch of government, although it cedes a lot of its authority to an imperial presidency.
Well, it's a fascinating read to see the collection of your weekly columns over the years, and it's such a great pleasure to get to talk to you today. So, Ralph Nader, thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Kevin, and anybody who wants to get my weekly column, go to nader.org. You get it electronically free.
Great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Well, Well, that was my conversation with political activist and four-time presidential candidate Ralph Nader. His new book is Told You So, the big book of weekly columns. Well, that's all the time we have this week for the public. Thanks to CIUT station manager Ken Stour, as well as Eric Betlam. To make sure you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to our podcast in iTunes. Just search for The Public in the search bar. Or you can visit us online at thepublicradio.org. And there you can find the full archive of interviews we've done with the likes of Jean Vanier, Jonathan Goldstein, Linda McQuaig, Louis Lapham, and Judy Rebick. I'm Kevin Caners. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.